Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and while we all eagerly await Krakauer's corrections to Into Thin Air, I thought I'd do a video on the Mountain Madness oxygen situation at South Summit. Here we have the accounts of Boukreev, Beidleman, and Gamelgard, and they all agree as to what happened. The Mountain Madness oxygen story is fairly straightforward, but the key to understanding what happened is a last-minute change in plans made by Lopsang. To see why this explains what happened with Boukreev, we need to look at what the plan was and how it was changed at the last minute. The supposedly finalized plan, made by Scott Fisher at South Col just before their departure, was that a total of 7 Sherpa would carry oxygen. 6 Sherpa would use oxygen, and Lopsang would climb without oxygen and carry only 1 bottle. The total contingent of Mountain Madness Sherpas at South Col was just those 7. Thus, the plan was to have all Mountain Madness members depart South Col as part of the summit push, leaving no one in the camp for Mountain Madness. This was not some plan made up down in base camp. It was made at South Col just hours before they set out, and all the leadership, Fisher, Boukreev, Beidleman, and Lopsang, were aware of the plan. The Mountain Madness Summit team thus initially was supposed to consist of 3 guides, Scott Fisher, Anatoli Boukreev, and Neal Beidleman, 6 clients, Sandy Pittman, Lena Gamelgard, Martin Adams, Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, and Cleve Schoening, and 7 Sherpa, Lopsang, Tashi Tershing, Nagwa Tenzing, Nagwa Shayakaya, Tenzing, Nagwa Dorje, and Pemba. Doing the math, you have 2 guides climbing with oxygen, and 6 clients, each carrying 2 bottles of oxygen each. You were supposed to have 6 Sherpas carrying 4 bottles each, 2 for the clients and 2 for their own use. You also have Boukreev and Lopsang carrying 1 bottle each. There does not appear to have been any intent for Boukreev and Lopsang to have used oxygen in an emergency because there was only 1 regulator between the 2 of them, and it was left on the mountain fairly early. Thus, the bottles they were carrying were for use by others. This gives a total of 14 extra oxygen bottles for 2 guides climbing with oxygen and 6 clients also using oxygen. Simple math shows that this means that the 2 guides can receive 1 extra bottle apiece for a total of 3 bottles, and the 6 clients can then receive 2 extra bottles apiece for a total of 4 bottles for each and every single client on the Mountain Madness team. That was the plan. But when they were departing, Lopsang made a last-minute decision to have Pemba remain at camp. Boukreev was unaware of this at the time it was made. It is not clear why Lopsang chose to do this, but it will explain some of Boukreev's actions later. Krakauer agrees and states in Into Thin Air that this last-minute change was done without Fisher's knowledge. It appears that information came from an interview with Lopsang. I will take the time to point out here that the fact that Krakauer and Boukreev agree on this point is critical. There is no dispute by anyone that Lopsang altered the plan and didn't tell anyone. Thus, when Boukreev was climbing, he thought that all the Sherpas had left high camp and were carrying oxygen. On this point, everybody agrees, and it is critical to understanding why Boukreev did what he did. Lopsang's last-minute change caused 2 major problems. It meant there would be 2 less oxygen bottles for the clients at South Summit, and most importantly, it meant that no one else knew about this. Boukreev and Beidleman were out in front the entire time. They had no way of knowing about this change. Thus, Boukreev and Beidleman thought there was going to be a large cache of oxygen at South Summit on the descent. Neither one waited at South Summit on the ascent for all the oxygen to arrive, as they both headed out to fix the ropes and were thus completely unaware of the change, nor was there any reason for them to be concerned with this. Scott Fisher was in the back, and if there were any major changes, they would expect Fisher to contact Lopsang on the radio, which he never did. Now, for the Sherpas carrying oxygen for Mountain Madness, all of the oxygen carried up was indeed delivered to South Summit, though some of the Sherpas then decided to head down the mountain and not to proceed to the summit. This was also not part of the plan. The original plan was to have all the Sherpas summit. Boukreev was also unaware that any Sherpa had turned around at South Summit as he and Beidleman were out in front fixing ropes. I will also highlight that this point is critical. Lopsang continued on past summit carrying an extra oxygen bottle, and that would be given to Pittman on the summit at approximately 2:15 p.m. Thus, when Boukreev and Beidleman reached the summit at 1:07 and 1:25 p.m. respectively, their belief of the situation and the actual situation are very, very different. Both Boukreev and Beidleman believed that 7 Sherpa had set out from South Col and that a cache of 5 bottles was available at South Summit, and the sixth bottle was being carried up by Lopsang. From an oxygen point of view, this would be a great situation for Mountain Madness. They had 6 clients and 6 extra oxygen bottles, or so they thought. All they had to do was make it back to South Summit, give each client their final bottle, and zip down to South Col. Now, that was not the actual situation, but that is what they thought it was. Also, at this point in time, neither Beidleman nor Boukreev knew that Scott Fisher was in such bad shape. Thus, if you take the information that Boukreev believed to be true while he was on the summit, it was that the oxygen situation was fine. They had 5 more bottles waiting for them at South Summit. The main problem was time. It was getting late, and it would mean that it would be cold and likely dark when they returned to camp, and what they would be returning to would be an empty South Col with no hot tea or water waiting for anyone. Boukreev believed that South Col was empty and that all the Sherpa were on their way to the summit, and that when the clients got back to camp, there would be nothing but empty tents. That is the situation as Boukreev perceived it at that point in time. If you take the information that Boukreev believed was true, you will quickly realize that the best way Boukreev could have added value at that point in time was to get down to South Col, gather up some snow, start melting it, and get the camp ready to receive 6 exhausted clients that would still have oxygen but would be extremely cold and dehydrated. Although there are other problems on climbing Everest, the 3 primary deadly problems are hypoxia, hypothermia, and dehydration, and that is not in any particular order. With the information Boukreev had while he was on the summit, hypoxia was not a serious issue because he believed South Summit was well stocked with oxygen and all the clients had just picked up a fresh bottle on the ascent. Although the part about all the clients picking up a fresh bottle on the ascent was true, the part about South Summit being well stocked was not. At the very least, it had 2 bottles less than what was planned, and as we will see shortly, that was not all that was missing. Given the information available to Boukreev while he was on the summit, the best thing he could do was to head down as quickly as possible and start to melt snow. He had no way of knowing that Pemba had stayed in camp. Equally important, Beidleman had the exact same information as Boukreev. Thus, Beidleman's decision to remain on the summit for so long makes more sense. He believed there was a large cache of oxygen down at South Summit. So Boukreev rushes down the mountain to get into camp and start melting snow. When he gets there, he finds Pemba. Pemba's already there and has the oxygen he was supposed to have taken up with him. At that point, Boukreev changes his plan. Obviously, he doesn't need to melt snow. Pemba has done that. Instead, he warms himself up and grabs 3 bottles of oxygen, 1 for himself and 2 to take up to the clients. By that time, the storm had started and visibility was basically 0. He heads up toward the fixed ropes, but misses seeing the group of climbers because of poor visibility and that Beidleman had deviated around the ice patch. I'll cover why Beidleman did that in the upcoming video on Beidleman's choice. Now, going back to South Summit and going back to much earlier in the day, Mountain Madness team is getting back to South Summit just as the storm is hitting. This photo was taken by Scott Fisher from the top of the Hillary Step, and it shows the Mountain Madness team. That is Sandy Pittman. I'll have a complete analysis of this photo in a future video, but at this point in time, the Mountain Madness team is descending just fine, the main problem being the weather. It is curious that Fisher was so close to his team and was still functioning well enough to take photographs. Fisher would never catch up to the team, and none of the Mountain Madness clients reported seeing him from South Summit, though had the weather been clear, he would have been visible. As a note, this is the last photo of Scott Fisher to have been published, and I do not know if it is indeed the last one he actually took. Now, arriving at South Summit, the accounts of Beidleman and Gamelgard are nearly identical. This is from The Climb, quoting Beidleman. So when Beidleman and the clients arrived at South Summit, their cache of oxygen should have included 3 full canisters, and whatever partial canisters had been discarded when the climbers had changed bottles on the way up. But Beidleman recalled not finding what he expected. There didn't seem to be too many left. There was one that was full or practically full, and a few others he added that were partially full. The full bottle, I believe, at that time went to Lena. And from Gamelgard. Next to the oxygen cache. How is my oxygen situation? Almost empty. How many of us are there? How many full or less empty bottles? I checked several bottles in the pile. Empty, almost full, full. There's no system any longer. Order has changed to chaos. So Gamelgard is able to quickly determine the quantity of oxygen in a bottle, and fortunately, a couple of viewers of my previous videos on the oxygen system found a YouTube video called Sherpa's True Heroes of Mount Everest, and it shows a clip of Sherpa changing an oxygen bottle, which is the same thing as saying attaching a regulator to the...
At this point, the other members exchanged the first oxygen bottles.
Now, I will note that that is the wrong way to attach a regulator to a bottle. Typically, you hold the regulator in one hand and spin the bottle in the other hand, but this technique requires more experience, and if you don't do it correctly, you can cross-thread the bottle. In any case, you can hear the oxygen venting, and you can see that attaching a regulator is not such a trivial task. So the Mountain Madness clients faced a similar problem to that of the venture consultants on the South Summit. Of the 3 full bottles that were supposed to be there, only 1 was actually full. There was originally supposed to be 5. The Sherpa didn't bring up 2, and so that's why there's only supposed to be 3 at this point in time. So the 1 full bottle was initially given to Gamelgard, but then they swapped out with a pitman below South Summit. Now, this is a photo of the aftermath on South Summit. I've cropped it and blurred out any section that contains Rob Hall's body, but looking at the oxygen bottles in that photo, you can easily see how describing the situation as chaos is very accurate. Ultimately, it is not clear what caused the major problems with oxygen disappearing on South Summit. While oxygen bottle theft remains a distinct possibility, there's so much oxygen missing that it is unlikely to be the sole explanation. More than likely, some combination of theft, people picking up the wrong bottles, and people mixing up the bottles as they place their half-full bottles back in the cache may have caused the problems. For Mountain Madness, we know exactly how many bottles were supposed to be there, and that oxygen was not there. Neal Beidleman spent some time on South Summit after his team had started descending, but was not able to locate any additional, even partially full bottles. Beidleman left South Summit carrying 2 bottles, each with an extremely small amount of oxygen. As for Scott Fisher, it was reported he picked up his 3rd bottle on South Summit on the ascent. This would have been at approximately 1 p.m. in the best case scenario. With 6 hours of oxygen running on 2 liters per minute, this would have him run out of oxygen at approximately 7 p.m. At one point, Lopsang reported Fisher had taken his mask off, so it is not clear exactly what Scott Fisher's oxygen situation was. The curious issue with the Mountain Madness oxygen situation is that all the accounts agree on what happened, even Krakauer's, but also Beidleman's, Boukreev, and Gamelgard's. But there was no analysis of what impact the oxygen situation had on the overall climb. My criticism of Boukreev's decline is that Boukreev treats oxygen as some minor detail that people simply need to have with them. But this is most likely because he didn't need oxygen, and he didn't seem to really have a firm understanding of what a huge difference it made for other climbers. However, Boukreev did accurately report all the details of how much oxygen was brought up. He does note that some of the bottles were missing, and he puts this in a footnote. In my analysis, the oxygen is not a footnote, but rather a key component of what went wrong. And viewers of the 1996 videos will notice a distinct difference between this video and the other ones. Here, everyone agrees on the facts of what happened. And while my analysis differs from Boukreev's, that is not because Boukreev was inventing things or leaving out key details. The way he looked at the situation more than 20 years ago, while he was still alive, is just very different than I look at it today. For people who have read The Climb, you will notice significant differences between my analysis and Boukreev's, especially as it relates to how the oxygen was supposed to be allocated to the climbers. Thus, this is not a Boukreev did everything right video. It is instead a different analysis of the same underlying facts that everybody agrees upon. So, what was Boukreev's big mistake? It is not knowing that 2 bottles of oxygen were not brought up, and not knowing that Pemba was already down in camp perfectly capable of melting snow. Now, had a Yeti appeared on the summit and told Boukreev and Beidleman that they were mistaken about the oxygen situation, then they both would have rounded up the clients and started down the mountain, grabbing Scott Fisher and telling him that the planned stunt was over and as they were already too late and now 2 bottles short of oxygen. Could Boukreev and Beidleman have talked to Lopsang about this? Certainly, but there is no indication that they ever did this, nor is it clear why they would just randomly ask if all the Sherpas that were supposed to leave South Col actually left South Col. Lopsang should have mentioned it, and for whatever reason, he did not. Now, I have not talked about the Boukreev-Krakauer dispute, where Boukreev claims he had 2 conversations with Scott Fisher on the descent, and Krakauer claims there was only 1. But there is a significant difference between the way I analyze the 1996 disaster and the way others, such as Krakauer and the numerous people making comments on these videos, the way that they look at things. When I see two people telling a different story, one technique I use is to look at what the people did rather than what they said. Now, I have no idea what Fisher said to Boukreev, nor whether there was one conversation or two. For the purposes of my analysis, it would make no difference. I look at what Boukreev did, and at that point, whatever Boukreev and Fisher discussed is irrelevant. If Fisher told Boukreev to remain on the summit with the clients so they could all pull the planned stunt, Boukreev should have ignored that and headed down the mountain as quickly as possible. If Fisher told Boukreev that the oxygen was missing from South Summit, Boukreev should have headed down the mountain as fast as possible to gather additional oxygen. If Fisher just gave Boukreev a high five and passed him, then Boukreev should have headed down the mountain as fast as possible. That Boukreev was ultimately mistaken for the reason he was headed down the mountain quickly does not matter, because he would have headed down as quickly as possible in either case. The first case to go melt snow, and in the second case to bring up extra oxygen. But there are many factors that went into the 1996 disaster, and certainly the storm was the largest single factor. And in my analysis, I place the oxygen situation at South Summit as a close second, and for the Mountain Madness team, the planned stunt on the summit, a very close third. I'll have a couple more videos going over the details of the climb, and then I'll wrap it up with a summary and analysis video, depending on when Krakauer responds with his big list of mistakes in my videos.